This conference will now be recorded.
Welcome to the National Environmental Policy Act, also known as NEPA, introductory course on floodplains provided by the Florida Department of Transportation, or FDOT's, Office of Environmental Management, as covered in Part 2, Chapter 13 of the Project Development and Environment, or PD&E Manual. This course will cover how to evaluate and document floodplain encroachment impacts during PD&E phase. The course has been divided into 6 lessons as shown here. At the end of this course, you should have a basic understanding of the types of floodplain encroachments, the procedures for evaluating project impacts on 100-year floodplains and floodways, the documentation required in the location hydraulics report, the difference between a risk assessment and risk analysis, and how to document potential floodplain impacts evaluation in the environmental document. Lesson 1 provides an overview of the course and types of floodplain encroachments. This course addresses the NEPA requirements for evaluation of a project's potential floodplain impacts. Protection of floodplains and floodways is required by Executive Order 11988, Floodplain Management, U.S. DOT Order 5650.2, Floodplain Management and Protection, and Federal Aid Policy Guide on Location and Hydraulics Design of Encroachments on Floodplains, as codified in Title 23 of the Code of Federal Regulations, Part 650A. The intent of these requirements is to avoid or minimize highway and land use development encroachments that reduce storage or increase water surface elevations within 100-year floodplains or base floodplains. Location hydraulic study required by Title 23 of the Code of Federal Regulations, Part 650A, must be prepared commensurate with the level of encroachment to allow consistent evaluation and identification of impacts. The results of location hydraulic studies are documented in the Location Hydraulics Report. The Location Hydraulics Report must be reviewed by the District Drainage Engineer to verify that all base floodplains are identified in the Location Hydraulics Report is consistent with existing base and floodplain management programs. The results of the location hydraulic studies are briefly summarized in the environmental document and considered when making the NEPA decision. A floodplain is defined as any land area susceptible to being inundated by floodwaters from any source. The base flood, commonly referred to as the 100-year flood, is the flood or tidal event having a 1% chance of being equaled or exceeded in any given year. The base floodplain is the area subject to flooding by the base flood. A flood insurance rate map, also known as a FIRM, is the official map of a community on which FEMA has delineated base floodplains. However, note that FIRMs do not show all base floodplains. All cross drains have an associated base floodplain, whether it is delineated on the FIRM or not. A floodplain encroachment is defined as activities or construction within the floodplain including fill, dredge, new construction, substantial improvements, and other development. Improvements could be as small as extending an existing cross drain or small amounts of additional fill within the floodplain, or as substantial as new roadway alignments traversing several floodplains and conveying the base flood with cross drains and bridges. On roadway and bridge projects, encroachments can be transverse or longitudinal. Transverse encroachments are those in which the roadway alignment crosses the general flow direction of the floodplain. Transverse encroachments are associated with bridges or cross drains. The top picture shows a transverse crossing of a floodplain associated with a stream. Longitudinal encroachments are those in which the roadway is aligned along the general flow direction of the floodplain, such as a roadway running parallel or along a stream or river. The lower picture shows a longitudinal encroachment along a river. Most encroachments for roadway projects are transverse. Longitudinal encroachments should be avoided wherever practicable, since they tend to result in substantially larger impacts. Regulatory floodway is the floodplain area that is reserved in an open manner by federal, state, or local requirements, unconfined or unconstructed either horizontally or vertically, to provide for the discharge of the base flood so that the cumulative increase in water surface elevation is no more than the designated amount established by FEMA for administrating the National Flood Insurance Program. The location hydraulic study is used to determine a finding regarding floodplain encroachment impacts. The level of encroachment impacts can be no involvement, no encroachment, minimal, or significant. No involvement is when there is no floodplain in the vicinity of the project alternatives. No encroachment occurs when floodplains are in the vicinity of a project alternatives, but there is no floodplain encroachment. Minimal encroachments on a floodplain occur when there is floodplain involvement, but the impacts on human life, transportation facilities, natural and beneficial floodplain values are not significant and can be resolved with minimal effects. Normally, these minimal efforts to address the impacts consist of applying FDOT's drainage design standards and following water management district procedures to achieve results that will not increase or significantly change floodplain elevations or limits. An alternative is considered to have significant encroachment impacts when it involves one or more of the following construction or flood-related impacts. A significant potential for interruptions or termination of a transportation facility which is needed for emergency vehicles or provides a community's only evacuation route. A significant risk to human life or property loss. Or a significant adverse impact on natural and beneficial floodplain values. Natural and beneficial floodplain values include, but are not limited to, fish, wildlife, plants, open space, natural beauty, scientific study, outdoor recreation, agriculture, aquaculture, forestry, natural moderation of floods, water quality maintenance, and groundwater recharge. Typically, if the location hydraulic study determines that the impacts to lives, property, transportation facilities, and floodplain values cannot be avoided, the district must develop measures to minimize the impacts and mitigate the floodplain in accordance with the FDOT Drainage Manual. Lesson 2 explains the procedures for evaluating floodplain impacts and the level of analysis needed for a project. Potential floodplain impacts shall be addressed for all FDOT projects which involve activities or constructions near or within floodplains. Each project alternative is analyzed for potential floodplain encroachment, and the results of the impacts, positive or negative or indirect impacts, are documented in the location hydraulics report and briefly summarized in the environmental document. The procedures for evaluating floodplain impacts involves the following activities. Determine if a project is located in or will affect the base floodplain. Conduct early public involvement and interagency coordination with agencies such as local governments and water management districts. Identify and evaluate practical alternatives to locating in the base floodplain, including alternative sites outside the floodplain. Identify direct and indirect impacts of the project on the floodplain. If impacts cannot be avoided, develop measures to minimize the impacts and measures to restore and preserve the floodplain as appropriate. Reevaluate alternatives to determine if locating in the project floodplain is still practicable. Document the results of the location hydraulics report and environmental document and present the findings to the public. The level of assessment and documentation for potential impacts to floodplains during the PD&E phase depends on the significance of the base floodplain encroachment. A location hydraulic study is not required for projects which have no floodplain involvement. Detailed evaluations are not generally warranted for projects that do not qualify for screening in the FDOT's efficient transportation decision-making process. These projects are typically Type 1 categorical exclusions or non-major state actions. Projects qualifying for ETDM screening and have floodplain involvements will require more detailed analysis. Coordination with regulatory and resource agencies, local agencies, FDOT district staff throughout the project development process is useful in identifying floodplain values, environmental data, and local drainage studies or watershed-specific studies in the project area. The project manager should coordinate with the regulatory and resource agencies, the local agencies throughout the project development process. Coordination with these agencies is useful in identifying floodplain issues, environmental data, and local drainage and watershed studies in the project area. This coordination begins during the planning and programming screens of the ETDM process. The preliminary environmental discussion for the planning and programming screens of the ETDM process includes a discussion about known potential project involvement with floodplains, drainage basins, watersheds, and receiving water bodies and their designations. This information can be found in the FEMA flood insurance rate maps and flood insurance studies. During ETDM screening, environmental resource agencies may comment on the level of potential floodplain impact and how the potential impact may be avoided, minimized, or otherwise mitigated in the PD&E study. The resource agencies may also provide current information on development and the proposed actions in the affected watersheds, floodplains, or floodways. The districts use the comments and the programming screening summary report to determine the level of potential floodplain impacts and how they may be evaluated and mitigated during the PD&E study. The information attained from the screenings can be used to document the existing conditions for the floodplain analysis during PD&E. The district should use the information from ETDM screening to scope floodplain analysis during the PD&E study. Engineering and environmental analysis should be undertaken commensurate with the level of encroachment to allow appropriate evaluation of floodplain impacts. Additionally, the project manager should coordinate with district staff such as the district drainage engineer, district permit coordinator, district environmental staff, and others who may be involved in the project. The impacts of the project on the floodplain must be understood before the preferred alternative is selected. Complete the appropriate level of analysis and documentation based on the project context, anticipated impacts, and outcome of any resource agency coordination. There are 4 levels of encroachment as they pertain to the base floodplain involvement: no involvement, no encroachment, minimal encroachment, and significant encroachment. The project manager should make preliminary determination of the level of floodplain encroachment and the types of documentation necessary for the location hydraulics report based on the field review, ETDM screening results, and consultation with the district drainage engineer. Where floodplain impacts will occur, the analysis must be sufficient to determine the level of impacts and whether they will be significant. The analysis will be documented in the location hydraulics report. Lesson 3 explains the requirements for a location hydraulics study and report. Title 23 of the Code of Federal Regulations, Part 650A, requires a location hydraulics studies for all alternatives containing floodplain encroachments and for those actions which would support the base floodplain development commensurate with the significance of the risk or environmental impact. Location hydraulics studies must include a discussion on the following: evaluate and discuss the practicability of alternatives to any longitudinal encroachments. Discussion of the following items commensurate with the significance of the risk or environmental impacts for all alternatives containing encroachments and for those actions which would support base floodplain development. The risk associated with implementation of the action, impacts on the natural and beneficial floodplain values, the support of incompatible floodplain development, the measures to minimize floodplain impacts associated with the project, the measures to restore and preserve the natural and beneficial floodplains and values impacted by the project, and an evaluation and discussion of the practicability of alternatives to any significant encroachments or any support of incompatible floodplain development. Every wetland and cross drain has an associated floodplain. However, it is not necessary to evaluate the hydraulic impact of each one. The impacts to flood elevations and limits are minimized by the designing cross-drain facilities in accordance with the FDOT Drainage Manual. Only those alternatives or design features that may create substantial differences in flood evaluations and limits should be evaluated. The expected change in flood elevations due to the project must be estimated to perform the appropriate level of risk evaluation. Alternatives that avoid longitudinal encroachment of the floodplain should include evaluation and discussion of the practicability of alternatives. New alignment alternatives that involve floodplains usually require a preliminary evaluation to determine the hydraulic capacity of any anticipated bridges or culverts. When new alignments include longitudinal encroachments, they should be analyzed to determine any increase in the base floodplain elevation. Alternatives on existing alignments that involve floodplains require an evaluation to determine the change in base floodplain elevation upstream and downstream where appropriate due to the possibility of decreased hydraulic performance of the existing structures. If the hydraulic evaluation shows that the flood elevations will increase either upstream or downstream, a location hydraulic study must be performed on the area impacted to evaluate the potential for flood impacts. The location hydraulic study should model the floodplain and size of the proposed bridges, culvert structures appropriately. The model needs to identify the downstream constraint or the tailwater limitation that is affecting the floodplain stage and limits within the project. The location hydraulic study should also evaluate the floodplain impacts to determine any increase in the number of flood receptors, as well as increase and damage to flood receptors as a result of the increase in flood elevations. If necessary, appropriate coordination with FEMA and local natural resource and floodplain management agencies should be initiated and adequately assess flood impacts. Whenever it is determined that a project will involve a regulatory floodway, the district drainage engineer or designee must coordinate with local agencies and FEMA to ensure the project will be developed consistent with local floodplain plans and floodplain management programs. This coordination effort and all associated drainage work must be documented in the location hydraulics report and summarized in the environmental document. The location hydraulics study should evaluate the impacts of each encroachment on a natural floodplain values must be evaluated. After evaluating the impacts to the floodplain, a statement explaining the significance of any encroachments will be included in the location hydraulics report for each type of construction activity in a floodplain. The evaluation to determine the significance of each encroachment should include assessments in construction or flood-related impacts to lives, property, and transportation facilities that serve emergency vehicles or provide emergency evacuation. Additionally, the evaluation should include assessment of construction or flood-related impacts due to determine the potential for loss or gain of natural beneficial floodplain values. The following floodplain values should be included in the assessment: natural moderation of floods, water quality maintenance, groundwater recharge, fish and wildlife habitat, plants, open space and natural beauty, recreation, agriculture, and aquaculture, forestry. If floodplain analysis determines that the impacts to lives, property, and floodplain values cannot be avoided, the district must develop measures to minimize and mitigate the impacts. Pursuant to Title 23 of the Code of Federal Regulations, Section 650.113, a proposed alternative which includes a significant encroachment will not be approved unless it is the only practicable alternative. The finding of the only practical alternative must be approved by FHWA. To obtain the finding, the district must provide the recommendation and supporting information to the district's FHWA transportation engineer and a copy to OEM. The only practical alternative finding must be included in the final environmental document and must be supported by the following information: the reasons why the proposed action must be located in the floodplain, the alternatives considered and why they were not practicable, and a statement indicating whether the action conforms to applicable state or local floodplain protection standards. Risk, as defined in Title 23 of the Code of Federal Regulations, Section 650.105, means the consequences associated with the probability of flooding attributed to an encroachment. It shall include the potential for property loss and hazard to life during the service life of the highway. Determination of floodplain encroachment includes the evaluation of flood-related risks to the project and surrounding environment with respect to the following: risks to transportation infrastructure. These include road closure and repair costs. Risks to highway users. These include loss of life and service disruption. Risks to residents. These include damages, service disruption, and property loss. Typically, the level of risk is reduced through the application of design standards and drainage design procedures. FDOT has established design parameters for the design frequency, backwater limitations, and limiting velocity, which are based on the importance of the transportation facility to the system and allowable risk for that facility. Additionally, design standards for other agencies have control or jurisdiction over the waterway or facility concerned are considered in the evaluation. To quantify the risk on project alternatives that encroach floodplains, FDOT uses risk assessment or risk analysis depending on the significance of the floodplain encroachment. Risk assessment is performed for minimal encroachments, while risk analysis is performed for significant encroachments that are anticipated to increase or substantially change floodplain elevations or limits. Risk assessments is a subjective analysis of the risk resulting from various design alternatives, without detailed quantification of flood risk and losses. It may consist of developing construction costs for each alternative and substantially comparing the risk associated with each alternative. A risk assessment is more appropriate for small structures or for structures which size is not influenced by hydraulic constraints. Risk analysis is an economic comparison of the alternatives using expected total cost that combine construction costs and risk costs to determine the alternative with the least total expected cost to the public. It should include probable flood-related costs during the service life of the facility for highway operation, maintenance and repair, for highway aggravated flood damage to other property, and for additional or interrupted highway travel. See Chapter 4 of the Drainage Design Guide for more information on this evaluation. If a project has no encroachment or no involvement, a location hydraulics report is not required, and the review of the project alternatives is documented in the environmental document and the preliminary engineering report. If a project has minimal impacts due to floodplain encroachments, the location hydraulics report should describe the types of construction activities near the floodplains and include descriptions of the measures to avoid and minimize floodplain impacts resulting from the project. Any commitments made to restore and preserve floodplains should be documented in the environmental document in accordance with the FDOT commitments procedure. Documentation for minimal encroachments is required and must include items shown in the chapter, such as project description, determination of whether the proposed action is in the base floodplain, impacts on the base floodplain, and the likelihood of flood risk or overtopping, and location of the overtopping and the backwater. The documentation must also discuss any measures to minimize floodplain impacts associated with the project and measures to restore and preserve natural and beneficial floodplain values impacted by the project. If the project will result in significant encroachment, the location hydraulics report should discuss the following items in addition to the items required for minimal encroachments. Measures to minimize floodplain impacts associated with the project. The practicability of avoidance alternatives to significant encroachments or support of incompatible floodplain development. The hydraulic adequacy of existing structures. The frequency of traffic interruption due to flooding of the existing facility. When replacing structures and for structures proposed as alternatives on new alignments, discuss the requirements to meet hydraulic needs for the project. Drainage problems which would result from extending or replacing existing structures, in addition to downstream tailwater constraints that affect the flood elevations within the project limits. Estimate both the existing floodplain values or the capacity and the volume of the encroachment, and flooding impacts to private property both upstream and downstream. If the project involves a bridge over a floodplain or floodway, and if a separate bridge hydraulic report, also known as a BHR, is not prepared during PD&E, the following items must be addressed in the location hydraulics report. Conceptual bridge length, conceptual scour considerations, preliminary clearances both vertically and horizontally. Once the location hydraulics report is complete, its information is briefly summarized in the environmental document. Bridge hydraulic reports are not normally completed during the PD&E phase of a project. However, a bridge hydraulics report may be prepared to determine the hydraulic length of a bridge or the length necessary to meet hydraulic requirements, especially on situations where the bridge or culvert has a history of roadway overtopping. Correcting the overtopping usually involves raising the road and providing a larger hydraulic capacity through the bridge or culvert. If bridge alternatives will be developed to avoid or minimize wetland impacts, then a BHR will analyze and document the costs and benefits of the additional bridge length in accordance with Chapter 4 of the FDOT Drainage Manual. If the entire project consists of bridge replacement and no other encroachments, then the requirements of the location hydraulics report must be included in the bridge hydraulics report. When the draft bridge hydraulics report is prepared during the PD&E study, its cover page will contain the MOU standard statement shown below. In accordance with Executive Order 11988, FDOT must provide public notice if there will be significant floodplain encroachments. To comply, the district must include in its public workshop or hearing advertisements a statement that the project involves encroachment on the base floodplain and, if applicable, involvement with a regulatory floodway. At all public workshops, the district should include information concerning any anticipated floodplain encroachments. If a public hearing is held, the presentation at the public hearing must also include any anticipated floodplain encroachments. Lesson 6 will discuss the documentation of floodplain evaluation within the environmental document. The results of the floodplain analysis and the level of impact must be included in the environmental document. Section 13.2.4 of Part 2, Chapter 13 provides specific details for required supporting documentation for each type of environmental document. Section 13.2.4 also provides guidance on where within the environmental document the floodplain evaluation is summarized. The summary should identify the number of encroachments and any support of incompatible floodplain development and their potential impacts. The exhibits, which display the alternatives, the base floodplains, and where applicable, the regulatory floodways, should be developed and attached to the environmental document. If floodplains are present within the project area, the results of the floodplain analysis should be summarized in the Type 2 Categorical Exclusions determination form. Based on the level of encroachment, the summary should at a minimum answer the following questions. Is there a floodplain within the vicinity of the proposed alternatives? Will there be an encroachment or benefit to the floodplain as a result of the project? What type of encroachment impact will the recommended alternative have on the floodplain, and what is the level of encroachment? What measures have been taken to minimize and mitigate floodplain impacts associated with the project? If the project involves a regulatory floodway, then the supporting documentation to the Type 2 Categorical Exclusions determination form must address the project consistency with the regulatory floodway's ability to discharge the base flood without cumulatively increasing the water surface elevation more than the designated height, and demonstrate coordination with FEMA and local floodway management agencies on the consistency issue. State Environmental Impacts Reports summarize the results of the Location Hydraulics Report and any coordination that took place in the Environmental Analysis section, and include the documentation in the project file. The floodplain sections of an Environmental Assessment, or EA, and the Draft Environmental Impact Statement, or DEIS, must include identification of the geographic area of the base floodplain and determination of whether the proposed action will encroach upon the base floodplain or floodway using available reference maps. An exhibit showing the relationship of each project alternative under study and with each base floodplain and regulatory floodway involved. If there is no encroachment on the base floodplain and the proposed action will not support development in the base floodplain, a statement to that effect will be provided. If the project encroaches or supports base floodplain development within a base floodplain, the EA or DEIS should briefly summarize the results of the Location Hydraulics Report. Where the encroachment results in the substantial impacts or supports incompatible floodplain development, the EA or DEIS should provide more information on the location impacts and appropriate mitigation measures. The EA or DEIS should also include an evaluation and discussion of practical alternatives to avoid or minimize such involvement. If an alternative encroaches upon the regulatory floodway, the following questions must be addressed in the EA or DEIS. Can the highway encroachment be located so that it is consistent with the regulatory floodway? Or can the regulatory floodway be revised to accommodate the project? Typically, this involves a FEMA map revision. If the preferred alternative includes significant encroachments, but the human environment is not significantly affected, the finding must be provided in the floodplain section of the EA with finding of no significant impacts. If the preferred alternative includes significant encroachments that significantly affect the human environment, the environmental analysis section and the executive summary of the final environmental impact statement must include an only practical alternative finding required by 23 CFR 650.113 and Executive Order 11988. If the preferred alternative encroaches on a regulatory floodway, the FONSI or FEIS should discuss the consistency of the action with the regulatory floodway. If a regulatory floodway revision is necessary, the FONSI or FEIS should include evidence from FEMA and local and state agencies indicating that such a revision is acceptable. If the project has no involvement or is not located in a floodplain, a finding is still provided. FDOT has developed statements that may be appropriate for common types of base floodplain construction activities not resulting in significant floodplain impacts. The chapter contains 6 statements that should be used for the following conditions: projects which will not involve any work below the 100-year flood elevation, projects which will not involve the replacement or modification of any drainage structures, projects involving modifications of existing drainage structures, projects on existing alignment involving replacement and existing drainage structures with no record of drainage problems, projects on existing alignment involving replacement of drainage structures in heavily urbanized floodplains. These statements should be modified based on the results of the location hydraulic studies documented in the location hydraulics report. That concludes this webinar. Thank you for your time.